So, hi everyone. Today, we're gonna be talking about one of the most famous business case studies in modern history, which is Nike, the absolute king of cool sportwears in the 1990s, that suddenly hit a wall over international labor practices. So now, to understand this, I want you guys to think about Nike in the middle of 1990s. This company made over 9 billion US dollar, and they also controlled more than 40% of the United States sneaker market, the sport market. So personally, I think that they had the coolest logo um, in in the world, maybe, which is the swoosh, something like this. I think it's really cool. And they also had the world's biggest sport star like Michael Jordan and Tiger Woods that wear their products. However, behind this massive success laid a huge irony. So, um, Nike sold expensive and high fashion sneakers to rich consumers in developed countries. Yet those sneakers were made by extremely low paid and non American workers operating in developing nations across Asia. Then in 1997, a tragic event brought this reality into sharp focus. So they're really focused on this tragic event, which is labor abuse in 1997, when a 20-year-old Vietnamese worker named Nguyen Thi Tu Pong was killed instantly on the factory floor when a machine broke and hit her with metal parts. So while it was an accident, her death highlighted a growing global outrage. So Nike was no longer just the company of Michael Jordan, of the famous athletes. They weren't just the company of sportswear, but they also became known as the company of labor abuse. And why is that so? I know you guys must be wondering. So to understand how Nike got into the situation, we have to look back at the business strategy that created by Nike's co-founder and CEO Phil Knight back in 1962. So back in 1962, Knight came up with a simple two formula while studying at Stanford Business School. And these formulas were: the first one is um, outsource all manufacturing. So Nike wouldn't own any factories, but they would create a virtual cooperation, yeah, with no physical manufacturing. And they also hire independent factories to make the shoes. Secondly, they poured saved money into marketing. So they spend heavily on celebrity athlete endorsement to build their brand name. So their brand became famous because of these famous athletes. Then, to keep the cost as low as possible, Nike constantly moved its manufacturing to cheaper countries. So in the beginning, they moved their factory to Japan. But when costs rose in Japan, they moved to South Korea and Taiwan. But as those countries became wealthier in the 1980s, their wages went up. So Nike urged the supplier factories to pack up and move to even lower cost places like China, Vietnam, and especially Indonesia. Then, by 1991, an athletic shoe worker in the United States earned around 8 US dollar an hour, and a worker in South Korea made about 24 US dollar a day. But in Indonesia's capital, the daily minimum wage was just over um, 1 US dollar. So making shoes in Indonesia and China cost 50% less than in South Korea or Taiwan. Then Indonesia seemed like the perfect business paradise at the time. Well, they had low wages, obedient workers, and an authoritarian government that desperate for foreign investors. Um, mm, mm, mm. However, this paradise didn't last long because by the early 1990s, labor labor strikes began breaking out across Indonesia, and Jeff Bellinger entered Indonesia. He was a passionate American labor activist that became Nike's biggest nightmare. And why is that so? Because Bellinger used a strategy called one country, one company. He realized that to get the world to care about worker exploitation, he had to target the biggest and coolest brand out there, which was Nike. And the same marketing power that Nike used to sell shoes could be turned around to drive moral outrage. Then in 1992, Bellinger published an article in Harper's Magazine featuring an actual wages from an Indonesian Nike factory. So he made a shocking calculation that it would take an Indonesian factory worker 44,000 4,492 of hard labor to earn what basketball star player Michael Jordan made from his Nike endorsement contract. So how did Nike respond initially? Well, their stance was really simple. They stated that we don't make shoes. They argued that because independent contractors own the factories, Nike wasn't responsible for working conditions or wages. The Nike's general manager in Jakarta famously told a reporter regarding factory violations. He stated, "I don't know that I need to know." However, the fire spread in the 1996 when the popular TV host Katy Lee Gifford, broke down in tears on television after activists revealed her clothing line that was made by children in Honduras. That scandal instantly blew the doors wide open. Everyone became aware of the labor abuse, and suddenly media outlets everywhere were hunting for sweat huts. And yes, of course, Nike became the one that they target. Then in 1998, Nike hit the wall financially. Um, they hurt they were hurt by a bad image and competition from their rivals, Adidas, and the Asian financial crisis. Nike's profits immediately dropped to 69% in early 1998, and they suffered their first financial loss in 13 years, and they had to lay off around um, 1,600 workers, which were a lot. Then the financial pain finally forced Nike to change its strategy, its factory strategy. So in May 1998, the CEO of Nike, Phil Knight, gave a famous speech at the National Press Club in Washington. Uh, the humbled Knight finally admitted that the Nike product has become synonymous with slave wages, forced overtime, work and also labor abuse. Then after that, Nike stopped defending itself and they promised major reforms. And what are those? What are those major reforms? Well, the first one is they promised that they will raise the minimum age. So they will raise the minimum age, um, working age, to 9 to 18 is for shoe manufacturing and 16 for apparel. Then secondly, they promise for cleaner factory air that was adopted from the United States Clean Air Standards inside all foreign plants. And they also promise to have better management training. So it will require foreign factory managers to learn local languages and cultural sensitivity training. Then they also promise for external oversight. So they joined the Labor Association FLA to allow independent audits of their contracting factories, and they also promise to expand educational programs and micro loans for factory workers. Then you must be asking again, did these reforms fix everything? Well, I think it depends on who you ask, because human rights groups agree that Nike made real progress on their workplace safety and removing dangerous chemicals. But core critics like Jeff Bellinger again pointed out that Nike still refused to solve the biggest issue, which was the low wages, the underpaid wages, because workers were still making low minimum wage pay that barely covered their basic living expenses. Then lastly, what is the big lesson from this study case? Well, I think there are lots of lesson that we can take from this case, because I think it's pretty scandalous. But well, I will mention the three big lesson. So the first one is you cannot outsource your moral responsibility. So even if you don't own the factories, the public will hold your brand accountable for how your products are made. So even if you feel like you don't own the factories, they will still come up to you. Then secondly, strong branding makes a company famous, but it also makes it a prime target for public outcry. So you have to be ready to accept that. And lastly, denying problems like the CEO did, and he stated that we don't make shoes, only makes a crisis worse. So real change only happened when Nike admitted its mistakes and finally took action of the issue. They took leadership of the issue and they finally promised to change the system of their factories. Though I think that was too late, but Nike did change. Well, that is a big lesson for us that we can get from this study case. So now, that's all from me. But what do you think? Is a brand responsible for everything that happens on its supply chain, or no?